Story 1. My girlfriend Jenny and I had always enjoyed going on weekend camping trips in the mountains near our hometown of Ridgeview, Virginia. We used to live right in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, so obviously we'd find new places in the area to explore. Both of us had stressful office jobs during the week, so getting out into nature and staying away from home on the weekends really helped us decompress. At this point, we had already been on dozens of camping trips all around the Appalachians, but none of them ended quite like this last one did. It was a foggy Saturday morning when we decided to check out a new trail called Moose Run Trail that supposedly led to a nice isolated clearing with great views. We had never been to this specific spot before, but judging by the amount of recent reviews the trail had online, it seemed to be a popular hiking destination. We got our bags ready and packed our old pickup truck with all the usual camping gear, then headed out for the 45-minute drive. As we got closer to the trailhead, a light rain started to fall, typical weather in these parts that we were used to. The rain wasn't enough to make us turn around. We pulled up to the small gravel parking area at the trailhead, which was just off the side of the winding mountain road. There was only one other car parked there, which surprised us given the popularity of the trail. We were glad though that it likely wouldn't be too crowded. As we started to get our gear out, Jenny noticed that the other parked car's passenger door was open a few inches. We looked around for the owner, but didn't see anyone. I decided to go close it, so the rain wouldn't soak the seats. The whole passenger side was already damp. I figured the owner must have accidentally left the door ajar and hoped closing it would help. I came back to our truck to grab my backpack and hiking poles, then Jenny, and I started down the rocky trail. We talked about how weird it was for someone to leave their door open like that, especially with such a fancy new car. Most people would notice it wouldn't even lock that way. Anyway, the rain started to pick up, so we picked up our pace. The muddy trail wound steadily uphill through the foggy forest. It probably took us a good 2 hours to reach the clearing based on the trail maps. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was a small tent already set up right in the middle of the open grassy area. We figured whoever was in there was just trying to stay dry, so we headed to the far side of the clearing and set up our own larger tent. We sat inside eating snacks and laying our dark jackets out to dry. After about an hour, we'd heard voices outside. The rain pattering on the tent was too loud to make out what they were saying. I unzipped the flap and saw two men kneeling just a couple feet away, staring right at us. They smiled and introduced themselves as Alex and Jacob. They said they'd been camping here for a few days already. I quickly introduced Jenny and myself and said we were just staying the night. They headed back to their tent, and I re-zipped ours, feeling a little weirded out. The whole interaction seemed odd, and they were acting strangely friendly. I noticed they were both wearing tight jeans and t-shirts, not exactly camping attire. And that tiny tent couldn't possibly fit two grown men. It really didn't seem like they were actually out here backpacking like us. Jenny agreed it was bizarre. To be safe, we left a portion of the tent unzipped so we could keep an eye on them. Another hour went by uneventfully. We didn't see or hear anything more from the men. I guess they were cramped up in their tiny tent the whole time. By now, it was getting dark, so we decided to settle in for the night. I zipped the tent fully closed again and snuggled into my sleeping bag next to Jenny. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up hours later needing to pee. It was still raining steadily outside. I put on my rain poncho so I wouldn't get soaked and headed out into the dark forest to find a tree. Over the sound of the downpour, I suddenly heard voices. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I spun around searching the trees, paranoia creeping up. Then I glanced at the tent in the middle of the clearing. The front zipper was wide open. I could barely see through the rain and darkness, but it looked empty inside. I knew something wasn't right. Those men had said they were staying overnight in that tent. My heart racing now, I ran back over to my own tent and shook Jenny awake. I quickly explained the situation, and although she was groggy, I could tell she shared my worry. As we whispered about what to do next, we both heard the voices again from right outside our tent. Adrenaline pumping, I told Jenny to pack up fast in case we needed to make a run for it. I grabbed my small pocket knife and cautiously stepped outside. There, standing just feet away in the shadows, were the two men from before. I remember so clearly the empty look on their faces as they stared right at me. No emotion at all. I knew in that instant these guys were planning something sinister. They were not afraid of me or my little knife at all. Before I could react, Jenny unzipped the tent behind me. I guess that jolted me out of my frozen state, because I suddenly yelled at her to run to the trail as fast as she could. I took off after her, looking back once to see the men just standing there, watching us flee but making no effort to follow. We sprinted down that muddy trail faster than I ever have, not stopping for a good 10 minutes. We kept up a quick pace all the way back to the parking lot, terrified those men might be on our heels. When we arrived, the mystery car was still there with the passenger door wide open once again. Wasting no time, I drove us straight to the nearest gas station and we called the police. Within 10 minutes an officer arrived and we explained the whole frightening experience. Over the next few days, we received more details that made the whole incident even more chilling. When police went to investigate the campsite, they learned the car belonged to an elderly man who was recently reported missing. All his belongings were gone from the vehicle. The small tent was confirmed to be his as well. But there was no sign of the two creepy men, or of any solid evidence other than their shoe prints around the site, and no sign of the missing owner either. To this day, he has never been found. The more we learned, the more violently ill it made Jenny, and I feel realizing how close we potentially came to a seriously dangerous, even deadly situation. We'll never know for sure what sinister plans those men had for us out there in the remote wilderness. But based on the circumstances, we can make a pretty damn good guess that it would have ended horribly. Sometimes the memory of those two figures standing there emotionless still haunts me. I'm just thankful we listened to our instincts and got out of there when we did. Our weekend camping trips are a little closer to home these days though. Story 2. I had a business trip in the small town of Willow Creek, Pennsylvania that ended a day earlier than planned. My return flight wasn't until the next day, so I decided to take advantage of the extra time and do some hiking in the beautiful forests nearby. I don't often get chances to enjoy nature with my busy travel schedule, always cooped up in office buildings and airports. The weather was perfect, so hitting the trails seemed like a great way to unwind before heading home. I woke up early and went to a local outfitter's store to buy some proper hiking clothes and shoes, since I didn't have any with me. The trail I chose was about an hour's drive away. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon. To my delight, there were no other cars in the small parking area. According to the park map, the full loop was around 12 miles and would take roughly 6 hours. I packed a backpack with water and snacks and set off down the shady forest path. The first hour was so serene and peaceful, with just the sounds of birds chirping and the wind in the trees accompanying me. Getting away from the stress of work and taking in the natural beauty around me felt amazing. As I continued along the trail, I noticed a man sitting on the ground just up ahead. He was leaning against a tree with his head hanging down and a hood pulled over his face. I assumed he was just resting until he suddenly lifted his head and stared at me as I approached. The intense eye contact made me uneasy, so I glanced back several times as I passed by. After hiking a couple more hours, I stopped at a fallen log off the side of the trail to have a quick snack and hydrate. I had only been there for maybe 5 minutes when I heard twigs snapping. I was startled to see the hooded man from before coming down the path toward me. He was still quite a distance away, but I hurriedly packed up and continued hiking so I could avoid any interaction. I picked up my pace, but a few minutes later, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. I moved to the edge of the trail as the man came jogging up and stopped abruptly in front of me. My anxiety spiked being alone out there with this stranger. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and held something out to me. It was a worn brown leather wallet. "I think you dropped this," he said in an eerily calm tone. I was confused and explained it wasn't mine. He insisted repeatedly that I had dropped it and needed to take it back. I knew arguing would do no good, so I reluctantly took the empty wallet, hoping this encounter would end. "You're welcome," he said with a strange smile before continuing down the trail ahead of me. I stood dumbfounded for a minute, processing what had just happened. I looked through the beat-up wallet, but there was nothing inside at all. The bizarre interaction had me feeling uneasy and eager to get back to my car quickly. It was around 4 p.m. when I finally saw the parking area in the distance after speedwalking nearly 2 hours. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. My rental car was the only one there, parked facing the trailhead. As I got closer, I noticed a man's shadow on the ground behind my car. He appeared to be crouching down, hiding. My heart sank, realizing it must be the man from the trail waiting for me. I froze, knowing running would likely make things worse. But I also knew he probably planned to rob me or steal my car. Moving slowly, I slipped my hand into my pocket and tightened it around my keys. I quietly made my way to the passenger door while watching the shadow. The second I unlocked and opened the door, I heard him scramble to his feet and run toward the driver's side. I dove in and hit the lock just as he grabbed the handle. He angrily shouted and banged on the window, demanding I give him the wallet. Ignoring him, I started the engine. I threw the car in reverse while the man ran back to the woods in defeat. I sped straight to the nearby police station and reported the incident, handing over the mysterious wallet. After recounting the scary encounter to the officers, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief on my drive back to the safety of the hotel. I called my friend that night to tell him about the bizarre trail experience. In the end, I still have no idea what the wallet signified or what that man's true intentions were. Perhaps it was an attempt to confuse or distract me while he went for my car or belongings. I'm just grateful I stayed calm and vigilant enough to make it out unharmed. But I'll definitely be carrying protection from now on when hiking alone. Story 3. It was late October last year, which is always the best time for hiking, not too hot or cold. I used to hike frequently with a group of friends, but it was often hard to coordinate schedules for longer treks. So I would regularly go on shorter solo hikes on weekends to enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. With a free weekend, I decided to revisit a trail I had hiked a couple years prior that I'd been wanting to return to. It was called Ridge Trail and formed a large loop, taking about a day and a half to complete. I drove up early Saturday morning and parked at the small gravel lot at the base of the trail. The first few miles were fairly flat, winding through open meadows before reaching a dense forest at the foot of the mountain. Around midday, deep into the woods now, I noticed a man walking up ahead toward me. At first he was too far away to discern much detail. As we drew closer, I realized he wasn't wearing any sort of backpack or gear. This struck me as very odd, considering we were nearly 7 hours into the remote trail. As he passed by just a few feet away, he gave a friendly wave. I hesitantly returned the gesture, immediately feeling uneasy about being isolated out here with a stranger. Just after he walked by, I heard his footsteps stop abruptly. Glancing back, he had turned around and was now facing me. "Where's your group at?" he asked in an unsettling tone. I froze, unsure how to respond. Did he somehow know I usually hiked with others? Or was he trying to gauge if I was alone? Either way, it filled me with dread. Not wanting him to know I was by myself, I quickly lied that my friends were just a few minutes behind me. "Good," he replied with a smile before continuing on down the trail. I felt shaken but proceeded farther into the woods, frequently peering back down the trail. As the hours passed, I couldn't stop obsessing over the bizarre interaction. The fact that the man had no gear or water made me extremely unnerved. I decided to set up my campsite half a mile off the main path, hidden among the trees, rather than at one of the marked sites. The sun was setting by the time I had my small tent pitched and my sleeping bag laid out inside. I sat outside eating a snack, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I eventually crawled into my tent as darkness fell, but sleep evaded me. I lay awake, riddled with anxiety. Suddenly, after an hour or so, I heard leaves rustling and then the unmistakable crunch of footsteps approaching from behind my tent. I froze, heart pounding. The steps grew louder as they neared my camp. But then, abruptly, the woods went silent. Whoever it was had stopped just out of sight behind the trees, waiting. I lay paralyzed in terror for hours, listening intently to the still forest, but the footsteps never resumed. As the first light of dawn began illuminating the woods, I finally worked up the nerve to exit my tent cautiously. Scanning the trees surrounding the small clearing, there was no sign of anyone. I hurriedly packed up my gear, constantly peering around for any movement. Just as I was about to head back to the main trail, I noticed distinct footprints in the dirt behind some bushes near where I camped. Panic flooded over me, and I sprinted to the trail, not looking back. I realized then someone had been stealthily following me and knew my isolated campsite location. Once I regained the marked path, I moved as quickly as possible in the direction of the parking lot, too afraid to continue on the loop. The sun was setting again by the time I made it back to my car, exhausted both physically and mentally. I told my friends about the disturbing events, and they agreed unlucky things didn't escalate. I reported the strange man to the local police, though there was little they could do without more evidence. I'm much more cautious when hiking alone now. To this day, I have no idea what that man's true intentions were, and I hope no one ever has to find out. But the paranoia from that experience will stay with me every time I venture into the remote wilderness.